Throughout the time period following Jackson's presidency, the United States continued to expand westward, egged on by the U.S. government supplying land for use out in the territories. While there were setbacks during this time, mostly due to American Indians taking stands to keep their territory, on the whole, westward expansion functioned swimmingly. The Oregon Trail helped thousands move out west, and later on inspired that video game that all of us were actually playing in computer class, at least until the school uninstalled it from the computers. The California Gold Rush caused a feverish, rush to get rich on the West Coast, and finally the United States was a nation spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific. However, before that goal was completely realized, the United States still was out to acquire that territory. While they did have some of the Pacific Northwest due to a deal with Great Britain, though that happened a couple months after the declaration of war against Mexico, the U.S. had greater territorial ambitions. This conflict, though, was rather straightforward on the U.S. side of the war. So instead, what this video will focus on is the factors Texas and the Comanche tribe played in the war, and the motivations of Mexico and the U.S. before, during, and after the war. In the early part of the 19th century, Texas, like most Mexican border states that the U.S. would later acquire, was rather desolate due to the strong presence of several American Indian tribes in the area. Settling in these states far from the Mexican capital was dangerous, as coordinated raids were consistently carried out with great precision by the Comanche and other tribes of the area. The Mexican government, therefore, offered deals to U.S. ranchers and planters to come in and settle in Texas. These ranchers would have incentive to protect their livelihoods, making it unnecessary for Mexico to provide military assistance to the region. These incredibly attractive offers were taken up rapidly, and soon the number of native Mexican-born people in Texas was dwarfed by the southern ambitious planters and ranchers taking up residence. There were a couple big problems to this influx, though, one being the fact that Mexico had banned slavery, and these new Tejanos were not obeying those laws, bringing their slaves with them when they moved. Secondly, the Mexican government asked that the settlers do two things. One, becoming Mexican citizens, which meant they had to pay taxes to the Mexican government, and two, converting to Catholicism. Both of these requests were unpopular with the settlers, many of whom left the U.S. to escape a strong government enforcing taxes and regulations on them. And secondly, as the Second Great Awakening demonstrated, the anti-Catholic sentiment for U.S. citizens was strong. For heaven's sake, one of the preachers encouraged his congregation to burn down a convent. This sentiment will also become relevant later on in the discussion on the war. Naturally, therefore, the New Texans decided that they would fight to rid themselves of these new requirements. And despite the famous setback at the Alamo, ultimately they prevailed and became the Republic of Texas. There are a few more intricacies, but let's get back to when the U.S. had a hand, or should I say more of a hand, since they had encouraged the Texas Revolution to begin with. Soon after the Texas Revolution, though, the matter of Texas annexation became prominent in the U.S. and led to the rise of power of James Knox Polk. Texas annexation was divisive, not because the northern and southern politicians didn't want Texas, but because of the matter of slavery. Suffice it to say, therefore, that the southern politicians were generally in favor of annexing Texas, and the northern politicians, not as much. In a future video, we will get into the whole slavery issue, because it's such an influential factor on the early United States that it deserves its own video. Ultimately, though, the election of 1844, when Polk defeated Whig Party Representative Henry Clay, determined that the nation was behind Polk and his very apparent desire to annex Texas. Some historians say that annexing Texas was basically Polk's entire political platform. After Polk's victory, it was not long before the U.S. Congress passed his plan for annexation, but there remained one small problem. Despite the fact that Texas won the Texas Revolution, Mexico never officially gave up their control of Texas, and when negotiations on the fact began, Between the two, there was a small difference in what they wanted. These are negotiations between Mexico and the US, to be clear. That difference was the land between the Nueces River, where Mexico wanted the border, and the Rio Grande. Remember, putting the word river after Rio Grande is redundant because Rio already means river, was where most of the US wanted the border. An additional problem was that the US also wanted to buy California, Arizona, and New Mexico, border states that Mexico wanted to give up even less than Texas. After numerous failed diplomatic attempts on both sides, the war was started with Polk's claim of American blood on American soil. A funny claim, as one, the territory in question was disputed, and two, Polk sent his army into the territory to occupy it, so his other claim that Mexico invaded the US was completely false. Ultimately, the war began, and it did not go particularly well for Mexico. Two U.S. forces proceeded with few, if any, setbacks, one sent to take the border states of California and New Mexico, and one to strike at the heart of Mexico, reaching all the way until they captured Mexico City in 1847. In fact, it was reported that during the campaign, disease killed more U.S. soldiers than the battles themselves did. Though, to be fair, it doesn't mention if they counted people who were wounded and therefore more susceptible to disease as battle deaths or disease deaths. Either way, though, the Mexican army offered little resistance, but that may not have resulted from the U.S.'s military power, because the Mexican army had been weakened by Indian raids for a long time. The Comanche in particular gathered huge forces to conduct raids in Mexico through a system of organized retribution, bonding different groups under the Comanche banner. During one particular battle, the army asked for some forces from the border states to be brought down to help swing the battle in their favor. But the garrisons refused, because if they left, it would leave them open to Comanche raids. Comanche raids were always a danger because of their proficiency in horseback riding and their quick and ingenious methods of fighting from horseback. The Mexicans' failure to control the Indian tribes within their borders, though, made the U.S. confident that Mexico was weak and thus inferior to the U.S., something they already believed because the Mexicans were Catholic. If they couldn't even defeat the Indians, who the U.S. had very little respect for in battle, they would be no challenge to the U.S. On the other side, the Mexicans believed that the reason the Indians were able to continue raiding successfully was because the U.S. was supplying them with tactics and weapons. I wonder what it would have taken for either side to realize that maybe the Indians were just smart tactically and skilled in battle. In any case, the United States swept to victory, and now the deliberation on what to do with Mexico would begin. As anyone who has seen a U.S. map as of late can tell, the U.S. ultimately took Texas, with the border at the Rio Grande, California, and the territory of New Mexico, which contained the future states of New Mexico and Arizona. There were some people, though, that called for more. Some people wanted to annex all of Mexico, but there was one reason that the majority opposed that idea. The Mexicans were Catholic, and the U.S. had already dealt with a huge influx of Catholics during the Irish immigration of the 1820s and 30s. The extreme anti-Catholic ideas of the time made the Irish routinely persecuted and hated in the U.S., and introducing another large group of Catholics would give the church more power in the U.S. Therefore, the final decision was to take what the U.S. had originally tried to buy from Mexico, and leave the rest to sort itself out. A precedent that still is followed to this day. Let Mexico sort itself out. The Mexican-American War was quite possibly the pinnacle of the ideas of manifest destiny, with the U.S. wheels of progress crushing those in their way on the way to expanding the land of opportunity. It would also be the last piece of territory the U.S. would acquire for a fair amount of time. So what would they do in the meantime? Mostly argue incessantly on the incorporation of new territory as states, because you had the process of trying to get statehood, and then the whole argument of the time of slave versus non-slave state. And I think it's evident where we're headed from here. Before we get to the Civil War, though, some may have noticed that I have passed over slavery a fair amount during this discussion of U.S. history. But no more, because the next video will be focused entirely on slavery. Get ready for what some call America's original sin. Hope you learned something and you enjoyed the video.